Hello, my name is Casey Manning and I am a philosophy major and I am a third year here at the university, and I decided to do my presentation on the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes and whether or not he'll approve of political protests worldwide. So without further ado, let's get into it. A little bit background information about Hobbes is that he was born in England and he lived from 1588 to 1679. He also lived through the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, and he wrote Leviathan, which is his treatise on government, in 1651. And the whole point of Leviathan for Thomas Hobbes is to stay out of a civil war because he lived through one and he never wants to live through one again. So this has a lot of impact on how he feels government should be run. Hobbes believes that we form and stay in government because of the state of nature. The state of nature is life before government, where it's very solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Every man for himself. Everyone has to sleep with one eye open because everyone's at risk of having their life being lost at any time whatsoever. In the state of nature, there's no laws, and we enter government in order to avoid the state of nature. Some of his core principles of government are justice, the sovereign, and obedience. Justice for Hobbes is obedience to laws and keeping your covenants. So keeping your promise is keeping your word. If you tell someone you're going to pay them $5 back because they lent you $5, you ought to keep to that, and to not do that would to be acting unjustly. The sovereign is a leader of the government who holds absolute power. The sovereign cannot also create unjust laws. All laws that the sovereign creates are just. Obedience is external obedience to the laws for Hobbes, but it's also internally, but mainly in this case externally, where if there's a law in place, you ought to obey it, because to not obey the laws would to be acting out of injustice. Some real-world examples of this are the Hong Kong protests, where the Hong Kong protest revolves around a proposed law, the extradition law, which would transport suspected criminals to mainland China for punishment. Hong Kong citizens oppose this bill because there's a fear of extraditing political enemies. Anyone who's a political figure that's outside of the mainland China that speaks against the government, they have a fear would be extradited to mainland China for prison, or furthermore, the death penalty. And there's a fear of losing civil rights because Hong Kong is a very democratic safe haven for most people that China just hasn't touched. However, the government's official stance on this is that this would protect Hong Kong from being a haven for fugitives, so people who commit crimes wouldn't be able to just go to Hong Kong and just be safe. And that's what's happening right now, and they don't want that to happen, to try to keep the citizens of Hong Kong safe. A little bit more about the protest is the protest became violent. Two citizens became injured by police officers with live ammunition, and Hong Kong citizens, as a result of the law being proposed, decided to destroy government buildings and metros, public transportation, just absolute chaos in the streets of Hong Kong. Hobbes' view of Hong Kong is that the protesters are unjust because they're failing to hold their covenant. Hobbes believes that when we enter into government, we lay down some of our natural laws, our natural rights, in order to be preserved. And he would also classify the citizens of Hong Kong as acting as rebels because they're denying this new law which the sovereign or the government has been putting into place, and their act of violence is relapsing to the state of nature, which Hobbes is absolutely trying to avoid, which is why he would say that the protests in Hong Kong are unjust. To the next one, the U.S. Women's March of 2019, women marched countrywide around many cities across the nation against the Trump regime to advocate for things like reproductive rights and justice, racial justice, economic justice, and ending violence against women, and so on. The march was a very civil march. It was a civil protest. There was no violence as opposed to Hong Kong. There was only speaking and marching and chanting around cities all across the country. There was a long list of demands of women by the government to have these laws put into place that you just saw on the previous slide. And they demanded these laws to be put into place for their perception of justice as opposed to the government's perception of justice, but in the big picture as opposed to Hobbes' perception of justice. So Hobbes' view of the U.S. Women's March of 2019 is that the march is unjust because the women's perception of justice is the opposite of Hobbes. It would hurt the continuation of government and there's no breach of contract. With the women's perception of justice being opposite of Hobbes, Hobbes would said before, justice is being obedient to the laws and the women are demanding more laws. With Hobbes, the only one who's responsible for legislating, coming up with, and mandating laws would be the sovereign, not the women, which would, in this case, be the subjects. This would also hurt the continuation of government because the whole entire point of government is to avoid the state of nature, and there's these protests happening against the government, which Hobbes sees as unjust, because when we enter government, we lay down natural rights in order to be protected, in order to preserve ourselves. And there's no breach of contract, even though the women feel like that they don't have all these rights and they may not have all these rights, the sovereign's still upholding protection because no one's dying as a result of these laws that they want not being to put into place. And even though this protest is a very peaceful protest, it's still unjust because it's going against the sovereign, which is totally against Hobbes' point of view. So does Hobbes approve of all political protests worldwide? Sometimes. It depends upon the sovereign whether or not the sovereign of the state or the leader of the government has a breach of contract, which for Hobbes would be an inability to protect its subjects and an inability to create good laws that would not violate the laws of nature that he set out in his book Leviathan. So if the sovereign does have a breach of contract, then political protests are just, but at the same time, they're unjust because they would be going against the government, which would bring them back to a state of nature, which is what Hobbes is trying to avoid. So it really depends upon the sovereign, and we can call out the sovereign as citizens and whether or not they have a breach of contract, but altogether it's up to the sovereign to decide whether or not they're breaching their contract and whether or not they're upholding to what a good sovereign should be. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope that this gave you a little bit of a controversial and very different view on political protests worldwide. Thank you.